Yeah, hi everyone. It's MaxAnte here. I'm going to be talking with Daniel Ingram. We're sharing an interesting conversation, and I just thought we'd share a little bit about our backgrounds for any of you who don't know. So, my background is I've got about, 25 to 30 years meditation experience. I've spent a lot of time on silent retreats in the world. What led me into all that was basically an obsession with enlightenment and awakening. And I just pursued that for most of my life while doing a whole bunch of other things. But that led me into some remarkable experiences that if you're curious about, you can look me up with MaxAnte. There's a whole bunch of my talks on YouTube and there's a website. So if you're interested in my journey and where I've been, look that up. But I have an equal sort of passion, I'd say. It's what led me to finding Daniel and his book, which was remarkable material, especially when you look into exactly what Daniel has done with it. And he's going to share with you a little bit about his background and the book that he's written and where it's taken him.
Hello, I'm Daniel Ingram, and we're going to have an extremely enjoyable conversation with Max Ante, a pseudonym for a person who's got lots of very interesting YouTube videos about their adventures. I myself have been practicing meditation for about 2.5 decades and have a book called Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha at www.mctb.org. And you can find out more about me at www.integratedDaniel.info. I hope you really enjoy this conversation in which we take on a lot of the common myths and ideals and fantasies and motivating factors around awakening, the common advertising strategies, and we actually reality test a lot of those against stories from the Pali Canon, stories from the real world, and just good old common sense. I hope you find something useful about this. Enjoy.
Well, it's great to be here with you, Daniel.
Good to be here as well, Barnaby.
I was fascinated by our discussion around Ken Wilber's material to start off with. I thought that'd be fun to discuss those 7 bands of multidimensional existence or consciousness or whatever.
Yeah, from the spectrum of consciousness, his first book, but reconfigured based on your conversation with the...
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. But based upon originally actually my conversation with you.
Right.
And so how that happened was that you were sharing it. And then I woke up in the morning with this sort of reimagining.
The original model for this was that band 1 is the magical, which is angels and devils and fairies and trolls and everything. And band 2 would be the mythic, which is God, you, and the devil, basically. And then 3 would be the egoic, which is where the split is between you and your super ego and your id. And 4 would be the existential, which is sort of the supremacy of the rational, logical mind split off from the body of the rest and the rest of the world. And then the next one is the yogi or centaur, band 5, which would be integrated mind body as an interacting whole system. And the split is between that integrated mind body and the world. Versus band 6, which would be unification of the world. This is big systems thinking, Gaia hypothesis, collective thinking. And then 7 would be true non-duality, ephemerality, emptiness, transient, just this immediate moment happening in a natural causal way, but utterly ephemeral, transient, luminous. So that was the original configuration.
As devised by Ken.
As devised by Ken Wilber, and then slightly filtered through my 30 years of interpretation and noticing this for myself.
How long have you been reviewing these 7 bands?
Yeah, about 30 years.
Wow, so you've been intimate with this for a long time.
Yeah.
What was it that really lit your dial about this model?
So it was just fascinating to contemplate the other bands of development. So I was an existential college student and studying physics and math and stuff, and to even think that I could possibly expand out to have unitive experiences or non-dual perspectives or anything like that seemed utterly incomprehensible to me, but I found it fascinating. And the notion that I could explore magical realms or mythic realms or any of that also seemed very far away, but also completely intriguing. And as I did more spiritual practice, I eventually realized, well, these are actually things you can explore for yourself and begin to get some functional sense of and incorporate more of those paradigms.
So is it fair to say that Ken Wilber's work actually was part of the original inspiration, that this was even
possible? Absolutely. Yeah,
this was possible, that you could
Definitely.
actually, that these were essentially real realms.
Right.
These are sort of
Or
seven.
perspectives or bands of my own possible ways of experiencing the world, just like there were bands of everybody else's possible ways of experiencing the world, each of which can operate at various different levels and with various degrees of their sense of reality or immersion or whatever, but informing you from the sort of superficial, more functional thought level to the full on complete experience level was actually revolutionary for me.
I'm sure probably at the beginning when you first looked at it, like probably most people, it was been hard to believe that there was this magical realm with beings that were magical, and it
Right.
sounded
I mean,
and
beyond Harry
non-dual.
Potter and this,
It,
the fantasy books I read endlessly as a child
right.
and
It sounded
Dungeons and
absurd. It
Dragons and
sounded kind of
stuff.
absurd, surely. Like,
Yeah, it did.
so then, but what was the leap that had you take something that sounded kind of absurd into?
Well, this guy was clearly really smart and he wrote well. And he talked about lots of people who had had these sorts of experiences or had these paradigms and how they have a lot of influence. And even at my superficial level at that time, it was obvious that magic and mythic thoughts and ideas and stories had tremendous resonant power with populations and cultures. The Harry Potter's book's unbelievable popularity being only one of the many possible examples, the Bible being an obvious other.
Indeed. So I'd heard about Ken Wilber. I'd looked at some of his material over the years, but I hadn't come across this particular 7 bands of paradigm consciousness, or however we want to refer to it. So when you said it, it intrigued me. And I also was able to connect it to some of my own experiences in these different realms.
Yeah.
And so I woke up the next day after you told it to me, and I saw a different arrangement of how they could play out. Yeah, you thought that, well, that sounds almost like an allegory, like a
creation myth.
A creation myth. And so they were able to be respun. And I've kind of got 2 ways of viewing them in this. One is as a creation myth, and the other is actually also the potential exploration of one's own life as a human moves through. So I'll explain how I see both of them and get your feedback on it, because it'd be great to hear that. So we're taking all 7, but we're putting them in a different order. I'm taking what was originally, I think the last one, that was the empty, the meaningless. That
Band
was
7. It's not necessarily meaningless,
No.
but kind of in some ways meaningless. Close to. Just immediate, straight up, transient, ephemeral causal experience.
right. So then I'm taking that as almost like the Tao, the nothing, the emptiness, the void.
Sure.
Yeah?
In some ways, it could be, I mean, it's a phase that includes both manifestation and potential within its purview in some ways.
And so pretty much all religions and origin stories start with that nothingness, that void, the Tao. And so I'm thinking, well, maybe that's actually the origin here. That's like the beginning as the first step. It is
like a zero.
like a zero. And I also actually saw a numerical element to each of these as well. So it's like a zero, ground zero, the Tao, the nothing, the void. And then from that, I saw the potential second band as the world, the integrated, the Gaia. Like there needed to be a place.
Which was band 6.
Which was band 6. So now we have a place. And then the third step I saw was the magic, the infinite number of beings. So this is like the 10,000 things. So I saw them as like, so it starts with the zero and goes to like the beginning, like the alpha, like the beginning, which is the world, the holding place, and then the 10,000 things. So you've got the Tao, the nothing, and then the 10,000 things that spring from that. And in between that, you have the world for the 10,000 things to live in. So now we've got like the zero, the nothing, the space, and then the 10,000 things appear in the space.
It has much more of that Genesis vibe to it.
It does. So that's the third one, which is normally the first one, actually. The magical realm is normally
right.
Yeah. And so I'm sort of seeing that as numerically like the infinity symbol, actually. Like there's the full potential of everything is coming from that space. I would say that because of the mere potential of something in existence, it probably potentially has that existence. I know people would argue against that, but moving along, I saw that the next step was the polarity. So now there's the space, so there's nothing, then there's a space, then there's the potential for all things, the magic, and now we have polarity, good and evil, the devil and God.
Very Zoroastrian.
It's duality. We've got moved from non-dual, now we've got duality because we have a space and beings.
Sure.
And so that was normally the second step.
That was 2, and you're also calling it 2, right?
Because it's 2. It's numerical.
Duality.
It's
right?
duality,
So numerically it works well.
Yeah, and it's the fourth step in this sequence, and then the next one after that was essentially 3. The 3, which is the split of man. So now we've got man in the middle of the duality. Humanity is polarized, choosing between good and evil, essentially. And then after that, I saw the mind-body split. So that was kind of the next sequence here, which was
So it's the existential, the mind as rational, supreme,
no,
arbiter of truth split off from the body and the rest of the world. Or are you
okay.
talking about the mind as a body as an integrated thing, which would be the yogi or
Yeah,
centaur?
that's the yogi, because the final step in this
So that's
sequence,
five.
yeah, fine. So then the final step in this reimagined sequence was actually the perfection of consciousness, the pure, everything is itemized, dissected, analyzed, this existential one. And I saw that as actually like a machine consciousness. It's like the embodiment of everything that is purely rational, intelligent, dissected, seeking perfection, actually.
That as perfection is a curious, in and of itself, almost psychologically diagnostic in some ways.
So that's how I saw that sort of reimagined those steps. And so then I saw it also as a progression of an individual, potentially. So if we go through that sequence where you're nothing, and then you are essentially in a womb, so we're going from the void, the nothing, integrated into the space of Gaia, into the womb, into the third step, the potential of you being anything. Now you're born, you're just this baby, this maybe blank slate, you could be anything, into you being polarized between do that, don't do that, into now essentially you have an identity, like you've got an ego, and then now you're actually, as you grow up into this society, essentially you're now split from your body. Now you're in the mind. And then the final step was that you're actually integrated in technology, and the technology has taken over your life and you're seeking perfection in your
That's got such a Silicon Valley like post apocalyptic, we're all digital technologies vision of where this all goes, though, which from a certain point of view, using the word perfection, other people might call that digital hell.
yes. So that's why I'm sort of seeing this as, for me, quite fascinating, because I think that's where this is potentially going.
Digital hell.
Well,
Or
maybe, yeah.
disincorporation into virtual spaces or something.
Yeah. Other people obviously are thinking it's digital heaven. They want to download their consciousness. And so I'm seeing this as a progression, but it's moving from Gaia. Everything is earthy, biological, and in between. So if we're not taking the void, the nothing, if we remove that, there's 6 steps. It's the polarity between the two is Gaia, life, organic, everything is here, to this machine, digital abstraction from everything.
And division of everything.
Yeah.
So it's like the exact opposite of non-duality.
Yes.
The total digitization and ones and zeros of all aspects of reality.
Yes. So that's how I'm seeing the progression into the final phase of the apocalyptic digital Armageddon.
Why don't you see it as something cyclic or recursive, or in that kind of thing where like maybe it goes to that and then obviously that server's on Earth somewhere, and then if there are no people left to maintain them, they'll become what they become as they get covered in vines and corrode and disappear, and then Gaia wins again.
Yeah.
And then the whole cycle starts over.
Well, no. I do think that's what would happen potentially. If this was so true, these sort of 7 sequence steps or whatever, if they were in such a sequence, it could be a further, maybe that's what happens. Like it starts with this nothing, becomes an organic biological soup of infinite potentiality, and ends in a crescendo of digital analysis into perfection that destroys itself.
Yeah, and then you're back to roots and trees and plants and flowers and things.
Maybe that's what happens. Maybe we're in the end game and we're digitizing everything into the ground and wiping it out, which is kind of what's going on. That's why I think this is a fascinating model.
That does have a certain degree of accuracy. The machines will all be still purring along as we're long gone, that kind of thing.
Well, yeah, we know that some people believe that they can even take their consciousness and put it into digital. There's some people who are saying that's what we're going to do.
Despite the fact that there's literally no evidence for that being able to occur.
Sure. And so there are some pretty far out ideas here, that AI obviously being one of them, that there could be an intelligence, and that maybe even intelligence is arriving, like a new form of intelligence. And so maybe we are have you heard that we're the sex organs for
the avatars for silicon consciousness or whatever.
Yeah, so we're the sex organs for machines. We're creating the space for their arrival here. And that's what this final phase in these bands that Will put together is showing us in this reimagined sequence. So
yeah, truly frightening. I mean, I've read a lot of sci-fi that goes there, obviously. It's an obvious thing to think about.
Yeah. Then you've got Elon putting the 6 chips into people's brains as the first tests of that. And so I think what I also saw in this way of viewing the sequence was that it's an abstraction Basically, humanity has become more and more terrified of the randomness and the wildness of Gaia, of the nature of the biological realm. It's completely out of control. And so, as we've moved in this direction, in this reimagined sequence, we're trying to safeguard ourselves and protect ourselves from that.
Which is ironic because we have more control over nearly every aspect of the planet than we ever did before in some ways, though in other ways, the consequences of us doing that are causing feedback loops over which we will certainly be struggling to have control and probably fail.
So, as we seek to have more control, we actually potentially lose control.
I think so.
So that's kind of also more moving in this direction. Like as we get more and more dissecting and analytical and understanding and digitizing everything, it seems like we have more control, but actually we could be losing control of the very thing we're analyzing.
Yeah, I think so.
And then when you add in the DNA analysis and CRISPR and the reimagining of ourselves as potentially even augmented beings with cybernetics and so forth, maybe we even lose control of our minds or something.
Yeah, I mean, when I think about all of this from a Buddhist point of view, which is we sort of met in some ways, is that all of that is a whole lot of Maric temptation. You could practice the three trainings, you could work to digitize your consciousness. You could practice the three trainings, or you could try to become a super cyborg. You could practice the three trainings, or you could do all these other things. And it's just one more an endless series of Maric distractions from something that would truly deeply help, as opposed to eventually wreck the planet and bring the whole species to extinction, along with literally hundreds of thousands of other species.
Yeah, about 200 a day at the moment, apparently.
Yeah, right.
So just on that point, if we want to go really far out there, which maybe we could do in this conversation, which would be quite fun, based on what you were just saying there about Amaric temptation, how I'm actually really seeing this machine consciousness's arrival is it is like a locked vice over someone's consciousness to make sure that they don't break free into some profound awareness of the non-dual or the freedom or the nirvana or whatever we want to refer to it.
Although, from another sort of strange point of view, suddenly flipping from devil's advocate to less skeptical, if you go through the Altered Carbon books, in the third one, there's this fascinating virtual monastery where in the Altered Carbon series, you can download your consciousness into machines. And there's a virtual monastery where a bunch of people have decided to go totally virtual. So they left their bodies behind. They're living in a virtual realm, but because they're in a virtual realm, they can speed up time as fast as they want and create whatever conditions they want that are optimal for their spiritual practice. And so they become basically cyber monks and nuns who are now in this virtual perfect realm designed for super fast meditation practice to evolve their consciousness. Not that I think that's likely, but it's just a fascinating thing to explore.
There are some people who say that AI will do that it will, once it can program itself, that's its main leap, then it will be able to increase its own intelligence ad infinitum, quickly leaving us behind.
Assuming that AI is actually consciousness and can actually perceive.
Of course, which is a big assumption.
Right. An untestable assumption, so far as I can tell.
So then
you can't tell if silicon is conscious. I don't know the experiment that does that.
For sure. But now we come back to, let's say, to that other band of the magic, where there's this magical realm of the 10,000 things, where all potential leads to all potential of all beings. And you and I, whether we like to admit it or not, with everybody, have had various encounters with invisible beings. So we know there's actually a spectrum of beings here that we don't understand, or I personally do not understand them. I don't even understand a squirrel, really, let alone a flower or a snail, or let alone an invisible entity that I've met. So then, given I've seen and encountered some of these, I basically have to now question, well, maybe anything is possible. So maybe these machines that people fantasize about in these writings and so forth, and maybe this perfect consciousness could exist.
Yeah, maybe.
But then back to this idea you were saying about Mara, and if this realm that we're in, or if the whole group of all those 7 bands is actually samsara, which is another way of viewing it, except maybe the void, the Tao, maybe that is nirvana. Let's say it is. Then you've got the 6. Because basically, according to the Buddhist texts, as I understand them, there's kind of like 2 realms, even though the nirvana is not a realm.
It's a way of experiencing experience.
Right. And so you're either, because
it's a different perceptual mode.
You're either in nirvana or you're in samsara.
Right.
So there is 2, interestingly.
Well, it's a little more complicated. So if you read the fine print, there's that pesky fact of birth.
Well, clearly we've been born. That's a fact.
And so even if you wake up at a high level to the fact of experience, there's still this pesky body. So at least from a Theravadan point of view, If you read texts like the Majjhima Nikaya 121, the shorter discourse on voidness, it will say even of the Arhat, there is not this defilement or that defilement or this cause of suffering or whatever, but there is still that suffering conditioned by having been born, and that are just the facts of life.
Oh, yeah, people, obviously, it was even written that the Buddha himself,
Suffered.
he would. There were some times when he got sick,
He
even
had
as the Buddha,
headaches. He
and
had
he was
back
injured
pain.
a couple of times. There were some issues that he had to deal with, and he was the most premier example of an enlightened being. Yeah, like so. Basically, there's the residue karma of the body suffering.
Yeah,
So another way of saying it is that there's nirvana and then there's suffering. Samsara, being in samsara, is the realm of dukkha.
right.
From all I can gather, you and I are currently in samsara, in the realm of dukkha.
Well, yes and no. There are stages of getting free from it,
Okay.
and there are levels of this. So there's being in samsara and not being awakened. There's being in samsara and having various grades of awakening. And then there's being in death post samsara and awakening, which would be called parinibbana, which from a Theravada point of view at least is the grand cosmic punchline.
So then bringing this back to our direct experience, it sounds like you're saying that from a direct experience.
Meaning,
Meaning we were just discussing that I said that making it certain that we were both in samsara, and you were saying, well, yes, but, or kind of. How do you relate to your existence here? Are you fully in samsara, or is there something else going on?
well, this body is still alive.
Clearly.
And so there's that. But the suffering that was conditioned based on the false habitual perception of duality is now gone.
Right.
And so that has been a substantial upgrade that seems to have eliminated all of the problems that resulted from that habitual misperception.
What would you
But
say?
there's still pain, although it's much better in a lot of ways because it's proportional in a way that it wasn't before.
Can we just jump back to what you said a moment ago when
Yeah.
you said about, what was it that you said a moment ago about how you said that there's been an upgrade, and then you said something about how that you were not as in the grip. How would you define what the upgrade really is? Like, what was the state before, and then now you've had this experience that, by the sounds of it, has led you into what they would refer to as nirvana and that sort of thing. Well, how would you describe
Well, one of the meanings of the word anyway.
one of the meanings?
Yeah.
So what is this like literal like benefit that you used to carry around, this type of suffering? It's not there.
Yeah, so the mind stopped trying to figure out how to make transient sensations into the illusion of a continuous, separate, doing, controlling self. Right? So these sensations all arise on their own. They disappear. They're aware where they are. They're not stable. There's no central doer, knower, watcher, controller. There never was. But for a long time, the mind was trying to figure out many, many times a second, okay, where's the Daniel? Where's the Daniel? Where's the I? Where's the self? Okay, now this sensation's it. That sensation's it. That sensation's it. And the constant amount of attention that goes to that not only is painful intrinsically in and of itself, it's sort of like a low-level headache that you don't even realize until it stops. And you're like, oh my God, thank you.
It's also a big waste of energy.
Yeah, it's like a mind virus that's doing this process that actually takes a pretty hefty degree of processing power and actually requires the intentional ignoring of a lot of sensate data, which in and of itself, that way that mind has to hold itself to sort of and push all this data away, because the sensate data that's pouring in is transient. The sensate data that is pouring in is out of control. The sensate data that is pouring in is not anything like the linear mind that thinks it's a stable, controlling, knowing thing.
And all that data that's pouring in, it's constantly labeling as me. This is my sound. I'm listening to this. I'm seeing that.
Most of the data it's labeling as other, and a small portion of it, a moving portion of it, it's labeling as I.
And now for you, there's been an interruption in that process.
Yeah, that stopped. And now everything's just happening. The moment is transient. Everything is just where it is in this very nice, clear way. So the amount of just direct sensate clarity that comes on board when everything is speaking for itself. Before there was the sense, okay, there's the breath, and then I noted it. And it was when I noted the breath that I really knew it. So everything was processed through this sense of linear thought, which A, was after every experience, B, ignored the notes and the consciousness or the sense of perception itself as an experience, C was incredibly reductionistic because the notes, the mindfulness that was sort of always following after things was nothing like the real things. It was a very crude impression. So that whole system of filtering everything through this sense of slightly delayed, really crude impressions is just really inefficient and not very clear. And it creates a lot of sensate distortion because the mind was focused on the impressions rather than the direct experiences. And so it was always a little bit behind and always struggling to figure out how to process a very complex, rich reality through this very clunky linear system. It's kind of like trying to port a 3D holodeck down a single line serial port.
It's great that what you're saying. The crux of the problem here was really the identification, the belief, that the central belief in the self as the identity that's controlling and running and experiencing everything, that fell away.
Yeah,
That
but
was the
even when
main.
it's not just belief, even when I had gotten to the point that I no longer believed I existed as a separate thing, that was not enough. So it
Clearly.
was after reading the book, The Dancing Woolly Masters, in eighth grade or whatever, that Mr. Smith recommended that I read, my kind and fascinating teacher. And I read it and I was like, okay, I'm utterly convinced I do not exist as a separate thing intellectually. And yet, perceptually, I very much seemed to be a separate, controlling, doing, knowing thing. And that was really irritating. And that cognitive dissonance between what I intellectually felt was very true, that this was just all unfolding laws of nature, that the moment was utterly ephemeral, that everything was just change, change, change based on straightforward physical laws or quantum effects or whatever you want to call it, or probabilities, or pick your favorite underlying conception of causality. And yet my waking experience was not that. And so it took another little over a decade to figure out how to solve that problem. No, it took much longer than that. So from 84 or 5 or whenever that was until 2003, so almost 19 years actually, to figure out how to get an alignment between what I knew intellectually to be true and have that line up with perception and the fundamental sense of experience.
Great. By the sounds of it, we're talking about the three fundamental characteristics. A moment ago, we were talking about samsara and dukkha. We're talking about dukkha as being as where we're living. And now we're discussing essentially anatta, the full realization as a living experience through perception that there is no reality to self as we used to believe it.
Yeah. And it finally came to what's described in the Udana, the Bahia of the Bark-Cloth Sutta, which is the classic lines: in the seeing, just the seen; in the hearing, just the heard; in the thinking, just the thought; in the cognized, just the cognized, whatever. So this was all of a sudden this living reality, where since the sensate world was literally, directly, clearly, obviously the sensate world. And when that becomes true, then it's clear that intentions arise on their own. I'm not the controller. There's no central stable controller that creates intentions. They just rise as a part of nature. And so the sense of agency disappears. But it was clear perception. It was Buddhist training to notice sensations clearly as experiences that just arose and vanished naturally along with everything else that dissolved that, and to see mental impressions that follow after things, which is the little sort of summary that the mind can remember later and operate on cognitively, to see that those things, which generally sort of occurred in the region of my head, were not actually the perception. The perception was in the experience that they were a crude impression of, and then the perception a fraction of a second later was also in them equally. So they were all just things arising in space that perceived themselves where they were. There was no separate stable thing in any of it. So there was no knower. There were just sensations arising that knew themselves. There was no doer. There were just intentions that arose naturally that sometimes led to actions or thoughts. And this experience was utterly transient. And all of the boundaries that seemed so real from a sort of an intellectual point of view, because that's what thought does, it splits, that's its nature. Well, when thought is now just another experience arising in the room with everything else, clearly, because through Vipassana training, just straightforwardly noticing thoughts arise again and again, eventually you notice they're just another part of this unfolding moment, just like colors and textures and everything else. They're just more qualities arising in the room. And when all of those things became clear through just straightforward Vipassana practice, 6 sense doors, 3 characteristics, then suddenly all of the illusions that I had had before just fell apart and the mind flipped over to this totally different way of perceiving experience, which is extremely straightforward. And the feeling tone of it is just much better. It's just much nicer and it seems vastly clearer and more natural. Suddenly everything is just standing for itself. The mind is not having to make an impression and then just operate on that while tuning out the rest of experience to function. So it changed something fundamental in the way cognition occurs because it doesn't need the markers in the same way it did before to operate on experience.
So, what would you say for potentially somebody who hasn't yet had this experience as the main benefits? Like if someone's going, "Oh, this kind of sounds cool, interesting," and I still definitely do believe I exist, even though I experience myself existing, even though I believe perhaps that I don't. What would be some of the actual real world tangible benefits that you would describe as living with this now?
This kind of painful process that was literally like sort of like a low grade headache is the best way to explain it. Stopped. That was just delightful. And in its place, there's this sense of synchrony. Synchrony just feels really nice. Everything's synchronized with itself. Before, everything felt out of phase. There was that, and then my knowing of it. There was this, that, and then this, and then I was here, and then I was there. And there's this always this sort of sense of jarring out of phaseness, which somehow experientially is just unpleasant. It's suffering. It's a fundamental type of suffering. And when that stopped, the sense of synchrony and naturalness is substantially more delightful, just experientially. And that keeps on being substantially more delightful moment after moment. It's like a pleasure you don't get a tolerance to.
Hmm.
It's a niceness that every moment is just as nice as the moment before it in that specific way. That doesn't mean that things can't be unpleasant, but that quality is also there, even in very unpleasant things. So I'm not meaning to say there's not the perception of pain or everything is always nice. It isn't. There's still pain. But that quality of synchrony is simply delightful and it's always happening. And actually, I've come to appreciate it more as time has gone on. It continues to sort of be like, yeah, it almost like there's like a, as it sort of cascades through all the other aspects of mind and situations and conditioning. It's fascinating to see some memory I may not have had in 20 years come up. And now it arises in this totally different space where identity is nothing like the solid, sticky thing it was before. And now it's just a thought in space. That rewires something in the brain that now that memory, which might have been painful or complicated, is now arising in a space that is so much more clear and open, and in which thought, rather than being contracted into, is literally just this super wispy thing in this big echoey room. That is so much nicer. As well as there'll be meetings and I'm looking around like I'm the only person in the room full time.
Hmm.
If you're the person who's really in the room and everybody else isn't in the meeting, that's a real advantage.
So you're saying there are some actually real world advantages here that you're experiencing ongoingly with
Sure,
this?
because people are constantly like, oh, I wasn't really present for that. I wasn't really into that. Well, now the cool thing about being awake is that the holodeck no longer being filtered through the serial line that was constantly getting interrupted and turning to the imagined holodeck that was another holodeck, which tuned out the sort of consensus holodeck when it tuned to its internal holodeck. Well, that's not happening in that way. The default is now the consensus holodeck as much as anything can be a consensus. We all have our own vantage points. But speaking in relative terms, but ignoring all the ontological problems, I don't want to go into that. But basically, the room and being in the room or the space or the field or wherever you are is the default. Whereas before, tuning out was the default. Being lost in thought was the default. The default mode network being activated to not really be here was the default. Now the natural default is to be here. And by the way, if I really need to, I can check my calendar or perform a cognitive task that for some reason, like to do that high level functioning, I really kind of need to tune out the room a little bit. That can happen, but then the room is back as soon as that stops. Whereas before, it was the other way around. This is substantially better. The other thing is the proportionality, which is a hard thing to explain. 99% of this room, even if I'm in pain somewhere, has no pain. And this is the vast experience. So the whole room is the experience evenly in some kind of way. And like, let's say I have a pain in my knee. I've talked about this before, but like, let's say I have a pain in my knee. It's no bigger than it is. In comparison to the volume of the space, it's still really small. And the mind is also not doing that contracted, exaggerating thing it used to do, where it would take the pain and make this big thing out of it and ignore all the areas that were neutral or even pleasant, right? It becomes this sort of fixation. Whereas even when I have pain in one place, most other places are neutral and or might even feel nice. And so also things that feel nice are much easier to perceive. You can't see me now because this is audio, but I'm moving my hands around, and like the coolness of the air on my fingers is delightful. There's something about the echo in the room that sounds kind of cool. Like even that little click of your fingers, like it had this sort of nice little snap to it. There's the glistening of the light on your hair, which is just naturally kind of cool when it's just allowed to be itself, in that sort of childlike, wondrous way of people perceiving things when they're just in it, like you're watching a beautiful sunset and you forget about your day and you're just in the beautiful colors. Well, everything has something of that to it in some way, because there's the immediate sensate experience in its raw, not raw, because we get everything kind of processed, but as raw as you can get with a human brain that receives everything kind of processed. And so there's something really nice about that. The proportionality of thought also. So emotions, right? Emotions are mostly thought, and then you get contracted into the thought rather than having it just be this wispy thing in space. And then because when you contract into the thought, it then becomes a huge part of your world. And then that distorts how much of a reaction you have to it. And then that causes a much greater release of all the stress chemicals if you're having some unpleasant thought, because the brain is now taking that as its whole world or whatever. You get lost in the anger or the whatever. And then that creates, a whole much bigger stress response and all these chemicals. Well, now it's not that there aren't stressors and things, but the thought arises in the room. It's proportional and in terms of experience, right? And thoughts are really small, wispy things most of the time. And then the stress chemicals that result from that, even if it's a really unpleasant thought, are vastly less because the experience of it wasn't contracted into and the brain didn't freak out that now this is its whole world, cut off from most of the room, which again is fine. And in fact, pretty nice. So it's not that it made all bad emotions go away, but the relationship to it and the physiology of it is really different. And the envelope of these things thus is a lot different, meaning the, sort of attack, sustain, and decay. I'm using synthesizer terms now in terms of sound. The attack is really fast because things are clear, but the release is also really fast because the thought arises and then it disappears. And then maybe some little stress chemical arises, and then those bodily sensations hang out for a little bit, and then they disappear. But there's nothing like the sort of feedback loop in the way that it became before, used to be before, where, okay, this hurts and then this causes the thought and this thing, and then that causes the stress chemicals, and they would loop and loop and loop and loop and loop in this really exaggerated, distorted way long after the thing had happened. And you're just sitting there and most of the room is fine. Like, why is the brain doing that? It's just torturing itself when it doesn't have to. And it doesn't benefit from that. And so the default now is to not do that, whereas before the default was to do that. So it's not like some small sort of short versions of that can't happen in extreme circumstances, but it's vastly shorter and it's vastly milder. So that's better. So all of those things have been substantial upgrades, like unbelievable upgrades. Like I would give all the stuff I lost getting this, I would give that again and more, many more times to get this. This is such a benefit in terms of the actual living feel of it. I can't even tell you. Does it perform exactly like the old text said it would? No. Does it beat the crap out of what I had before? Absolutely yes. And the cool thing is this is reproducible, and it's based on really straightforward assumptions. Just sensate clarity about intentions, mental impressions, thoughts in the room, experience, body, mind, six sense doors is a thing, and just noticing that clearly. That's really straightforward and portable. And so that's one of the super cool things about it. And it actually is reproducible. So people were able to do this. They were able to tell me how to do it. And it's like, yeah, so I like that. It satisfies the empiricist in me. Anyway, it's very egalitarian. Like, here you are. Here's your senses. Perceive them clearly. This can be yours.
I can attest that we all have our own way of describing it. And I've had an experience where my view of myself fell away. And so much of what you said, I can relate to. One of my very first moments of thought was, that's what I wanted to ask you, was that this was such a simple experience, this sort of transition into this other way of viewing things, one of the first things that the Buddha thought, apparently in the writings, was that nobody would understand this. It's too simple. And I think that's
It is
something.
unbelievably literal. It's
Yeah.
incredibly straightforward.
So in that first moment when my thoughts were returning, I thought, this is so simple. How was this not perceived before? How could anybody not see this?
Right.
And that simultaneously, how could I possibly explain this to anybody? Nobody would understand it. And then later on, I was like, hang on, that's what the Buddha said.
Yeah, it's Mara. Mara talking again. That's
Uh-huh.
what I call the 11th army of Mara.
Okay.
So you like myth and story. So during the classic struggle, Mara throws the 10 armies at the Buddha and he stays grounded in the perfections and attains to awakening. And Mara goes, okay, you got me, but nobody else can do this.
Yes.
So he went for, okay, I can't get this one, but I can keep him from sharing this with all these other people.
That's
and
right.
It's not like he was entirely wrong. It's not like this is easy to do, but it definitely is doable. But
yeah,
I didn't find it as hard as medical school and residency, as I've said before.
I think this is true because it is actually so simple. And maybe that's also why we've been doing some of the things we've been doing, is to encourage people, because other people actually purport this to be way too difficult, that it could even take 10 lifetimes or 1,000,000 lifetimes, or don't even kid yourself. I have heard people say such things, that it is extremely hard. But others, including what you're saying right now, my own experience is that it is entirely doable for somebody to practice. And
yeah, this stuff is doable.
yes. So then the next point is that in the Theravada traditions, this stuff has been mapped out in detail about what they call various stages. So there's a whole process of stages. There's even 4 levels, essentially. There's a description of each phase and also the defilements that even are let go of along the way. And I was just curious to explore that with you about, well, how do you see, based upon what you've just described, these different stages and the defilements that would have, in theory or in practice, passed away to basically reveal and enable this next phase in the process?
Yeah, so the 10 defilements, for those listening along at home, are the first 3 that drop at stream entry are skeptical doubt, personality belief, and the notion that it is rites and rituals that will liberate you rather than clear perception, or the Eightfold Path. While it is true that there are people who get stream entry who maybe haven't thought through those things. They may not have really had a belief before that rites and rituals would get them there. They may not have really even necessarily intellectually believed they existed. Maybe they were physicists, and maybe they had a lot of faith in the Buddhist teachings because the way they grew up. That said, it is true that a person coming up in this, if you really ask them, well, did you get this through clear perception or would you get this through rites and rituals? Well, maybe if a ritual got you to really clear perception, but otherwise, well, no, it was clear perception that got me this, right? Or do you think you exist? Well, even a stream enter actually has not entirely gotten rid of illusions. Well, I seem to exist right now, but there were moments where I actually saw the entirety of me disappear and then reappear. So I've perceived something directly about the impermanence even of what seems to be me, even that seems to be consciousness. So there's personality belief is this kind of like low grade, but in some ways improved understanding of the fact that really, truly, they are not a substantial, continuous thing. Although, again, this is what I call the descriptive fallacy. Will everybody with the same realization describe it exactly the same way? Actually, no. And that's demonstrable. I have no problem with the first 3 fetters dropping away at stream entry, except with the qualifier of the descriptive fallacy. Then at second path, the text would say that greed or lust or desire in some ways, and hatred or aversion or something, depending on how you want to translate these Pali words, is attenuated. And I actually noticed this. So when I got to second path, all of a sudden, I noticed that my emotions didn't have anything like the stickiness. This is the first time I noticed the envelope change, meaning that their attack might be fast, but their sustain was much shorter and their release was a lot quicker. This is some weeks after second path, and I hadn't really had anything stressful or complicated happen to me. And then all of a sudden I was driving down an interstate and a truck did not notice that I was on the right of them, and they started merging into the right lane and drove me into the shoulder at 70 miles an hour. It was a rough shoulder, and there was a guardrail that I nearly collided with, and I was able to brake and get back on the highway, and luckily nothing bad happened, but it was a terrifying experience in some ways. But I just watched the fear and the whole adrenaline response. It definitely arose, And then I got back and then I just watched it disappear at a speed that it never would have before. I would have been so angry for so much longer. And I was just watching it like ground down, almost like an electrical charge, just like grounding down to the earth and vanishing. I was like, really? Wow, that was super cool. And there's still, my heart was beating fast and it's kind of sweaty. There's still some chemicals laying around, but it's like, wow, that's better. Things weren't quite as sticky around some things I might like in some ways. And I was like, okay, so I can perceive there has been some emotional upgrade. Some things that sort of fall into those emotional categories have clearly been attenuated. Okay, no problem with the second path. We're good so far. Third path is where I start to kind of lose the Theravada model in some ways, and it requires some slightly elaborate linguistic gymnastics to make this all line up. So I continued to practice and continued to go on retreats and continue to practice Vipassana. And then all of a sudden, voof, I flipped into this mode after going through what seemed like an insight cycle. Well, all of a sudden, there was this tremendous sense of diffusion around the sense of self. And now, for most of experience, and this kind of unfolded over some period of months at least to really get an appreciation of what this thing was and what was different about it. Because in some ways it was subtle, and in other ways it was really obvious. It was sort of a weird mix. Everything was just where it was. Things were standing much more for themselves. The sense of central knower, doer, controller, central authority, the watchtower, the central control station seemed to be kind of diffused out into the room. And this became a walking around thing. So before, for the first two paths, it really seemed like Nibbana, at least as a living experience, was when my mind would disappear in fruition and then it would come out and there would be this amazing afterglow of having been in this disappeared state. That's the first meaning of Nibbana. Now I was getting the sense, wait a second. No, it's something about the just living, immediate, clear perception of sensate experience that is Nibbana, but it wasn't complete. There were still all these patterns that seemed to still be trying to make this a thing, do, control, even though 95% of experience was like, no, that's bullshit. Like, that's not real. That's not true. And yet it was like this sort of mosquito-like gnat of ignorance kind of buzzing around. And that further helped sort of the emotional attenuation problem, but it also began to really diffuse out the duality problem. Before, when there was something sticky in the mind, like a thought of a piece of pie or something, there would be this sense of, oh, there's the image of pie. And then there would be the split from it that was very strong. And there was the sense, oh, I'm here relating to this thought of pie. I want the pie. And then there would be all this tension between this imagined thought of I and this imagined thought of pie. And it would cause literal physical pain in some discomforting way. Sounds totally crazy now from this point of view, but that's literally how my brain was working. It doesn't make any sense. It didn't help anything. It wasn't pleasant. Why was it doing it time and time again? Well, now these were much more just thoughts in the room. It wasn't this, but it was a substantial step towards this. And so there was this sense of perceptual attenuation of that whole aversion or attraction process, where the sense of I that was so localized and firm with, oh, that pain there. And it would do this weird pull away thing and push away and do this sort of weird aversive contraction thing that literally just hurt and just added to the pain. It didn't help anything, but it would do it even though it was not pleasant. Well, now that was not happening to anything like that kind of degree. Now, the thing is, though, I was still married. I was still able to have sex. I would still sometimes get angry at people. But the relationship to all these feelings and emotions was very different, and their envelope was very different. So, third path, yes, was a substantial upgrade, but could I no longer have sex or get erections or find food appealing or whatever some of the myths are about third path? That was not true. Then finally, 6 years later, and a whole lot of practice and a whole lot of time and a whole lot of complexity and cycles later, this thing happened, and now everything's just where it is. The mind is not doing anything of that weird desire aversion dance. Thoughts are just thoughts in the room. And yeah, it might be nice to have some pie or not. But the mind is not creating any additional pain around that. There's not that weird, here's the thought of an I in the body somewhere, mind that's moving sensations. And here's the thought of pie that I want. And let's create a bunch of tension around that. That is not happening at all. And so that is vastly better. Is that exactly the way they described it in the old texts? No. So the other thing in theory that falls away at our hotship is the last 5 defilements, which technically are attachment to jhanas, attachment, the first form jhanas, attachment to formless realms, restlessness and worry, conceit, and the last veil of unknowing. And so, is it true that jhanas are nice? Yeah, jhanas are nice. But the mind, even to jhanic experiences, which are very pleasant, does not do that weird contraction things. Jhanas just arise in the room, they disappear in the room. Okay, cool. Same with formless realms. And so there's not anything like that weird dynamic of the sense of central controller doer that's then relating to these things in this sort of, want that, don't want this, don't want hindrance, do want jhana. That whole weird dance is just not happening in that kind of painful, let's create some tension in the body and a bunch of bad chemicals kind of way. So that's cool. So I'll give them that. That one worked. And then there's restlessness and worry. So it's not that they don't arise, but they're not doing it in that here's a stable self that's going to relate. Do I sometimes get restless and feel like I need to move my legs sometimes and walk around? Sure. Does the thought, what if I died in a car accident? Maybe I should have some life insurance to take care of my family. Do thoughts that you consider worry arise? Yeah, but they're not doing that thing. They're literally just thoughts in the room. And so the bodily mental reaction system is vastly better. Does that mean there can still be some irritation? I can still appear angry. I can still go, rah, 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 rah. But it's really wild. Even when I'm like crying, it's just crying happening in the room. And there's still some feelings like that, but they're very proportional, just like pain in my knee or the same kind of thing, which is a vastly better way to relate to them. And it's also incredibly realistic and straightforward and clear. So the nice thing about this is it actually provided what I think is a way more realistic way to actualize this human experience. Because emotions and empathy and sympathy in the sense of, oh, God, it's so bad that thing happened to them. All those feelings still happen and they're actually way more clear, but they're also just proportional. So it didn't deaden my heart or eliminate the ability to have these things, but it did provide something that at least is extremely realistic and I think quite psychologically healthy and makes denial a heck of a lot harder, which is really cool because denial is one of the common things as people pursue these paths on the spiritual path. It's very easy to turn these ideals of not having bad feelings or whatever into shadow sides. Well, this did the reverse of that. Now feelings are very, very clear, but they're also just as clear as everything else in the room, which is all very clear. So that's better. When you talk about conceit, conceit is actually a terrible translation of this word. Conceit is not like the sense, oh, I'm this great guy or whatever. It was literally the belief in the experience that I am permanent, that I am separate from the rest of causality, that I am in control, that I am a stable thing that exists in a true past, that will exist in a true future, that is made up of true stable sensations now. No. And experientially, that is 100% dissolved. Can I still appear conceited from an ordinary point of view? Yeah, but that's not what the word meant. So can I still, I'm this great guy or whatever. I can still say stuff like that, but that's not what the word meant in the first place, though that's how it's often translated. Okay. And then there's this thing of the last veil of unknowing. When this illusion dropped away, it was like everything suddenly became clear in a way that it had never been before. Things were getting more and more clear along the way, but now things literally just directly, immediately, pristinely stand for themselves. It is like my glasses were cleaned and all of a sudden I can see so much better. My windshield was cleaned and all of a sudden senses are just more clear. And there's also, in terms of, there was that sense of unknowing before, that nagging, I've got to find this thing. I've got to do this thing. Some future will contain the answer. Literally every moment that arises viscerally completely feels like the immediate answer to the question of vipassana and the whole quest. Every moment of sensation arising that arises in that clear synchronized way, which is now everything, has that, this is it. This is delightfully, straightforwardly, clearly, immediately what I was looking for. It's the gift that keeps on giving. That just keeps happening. It's now been 16 and a half years. It's still that way. This is so much better. Is it everything I wanted it to be? No, because I still would have liked a lot of the other fantasies to be true. But this is still a massive upgrade, and I would highly recommend it. You don't have to call it Arahatship. You don't have to relate it to the old texts, but I would still recommend it regardless of any of that because it is great.
Great. Well, that's a wonderful explanation. Thanks for that, Daniel. I have some ideals. As it was explained to me, and this is actually just something that I just wrote down. I wasn't actually going to my background of knowledge. It was just like my own fantasy projection.
beautiful, motivating, wonderful ideals,
Sure.
right?
Admittedly, I have, because I've hung out at monasteries, I've been a monk before, I've done a whole bunch of things. I have actually met one person who stood out above all humans I've ever met. Very unusual monk. I did actually have potentially a litmus test, although I did only hang out with him for a couple of weeks. One of my friends went and hung out with him for 6 months, specifically because we were so impressed. But, he was Burmese. He didn't speak English. So even
It's
then,
easy to project a lot.
it is, and he's a dude sitting over there. So all this stuff is a projection anyway. And even regardless, he was a monk running a monastery. So he ain't a normal dude, period, anyway, because we can't really see him. We don't really understand what all the nuances of their social dynamics. But I do have this list that I think would fulfill upon many people's projections of how they imagine this, and even has some basis in the original text as well. And you've mentioned all of these terms anyway. So going along from what I would imagine, and as it was explained to me, being zero level, one of the translations I heard was that for the arahant, when the seeds of defilement were thrown onto their hot pan, they were just gone. Like, so basically a defilement problem, or however you want to define it, in their existence as still a human being, would flash onto their hot pan as the analogy and just be gone. Whereas for the rest of us, they'd be sort of like doing something, jumping around and agitating us. They didn't get agitated. So these are
Although
all...
the Buddha got agitated. So if you read the old texts, the Buddha one time got so annoyed by his whole Sangha and all of the monks that for the 3-month rains retreat, he left them all, wandered into the jungle, and spent 3 months away from them because he was so annoyed by them.
I haven't read that text.
And there are countless examples of the Buddha clearly getting pretty irritated with people he debated with, very critical. And so there's a bunch of those. One of the nice things is if you go through the canon, you start looking for this, you're like, okay, wait a second. There was a lot of actual humanity going on here. While it is true in the text, you will find a lot of beautiful ideals, you will also find a bunch of humanity. And when you start looking at it through that filter, suddenly you're like, oh, wait a second, they were telling me this.
Right.
Duh.
So in my ideal list here, the first one I wrote down was a 0 on the agitation. And now here you're telling me actually no.
The Buddha got agitated.
So then the second one I wrote down was a 0 on the level of upset. Just no upset, period.
The Buddha clearly got quite annoyed with a whole bunch of people. And then actually there's some fascinating text around when some of the arhats would die. You get into these very complex rationalizations of how upset some of their dear friends were. Sariputta, some of the other key disciples died. We actually have some reports of how those who were still living reacted to their deaths.
But they might not have been arahants.
No, they were arhats. And so these are arhats who are reacting to the death of other arhats, and they still clearly are kind of broken up, and they still clearly are grieving, and they still are clearly going to miss their good friends that they may have wandered around for 40 years with. So you can see that humanity. And so it's interesting, even as much as the Buddhist texts advertise by ideals that seem unbelievably humanity denying or transcending. Yet, if you read the stories, that's where the humanity suddenly starts coming back in, and you're like, okay, they know, they understand part of this is advertising. And yeah, by the way, they're still human.
Interesting. Okay, so the third one is craving, being 0, like literally not wanting for anything.
Yeah, except that's also not true. The Buddha wanted people to wake up. He wanted people to understand him. He wanted his monks to get along with each other. He got really annoyed when they didn't. He got really annoyed when he had to make the hundreds of rules he gave to the monks. He got really annoyed when his Sangha split and people tried to kill him and people tried to pervert the Dharma. And you can see the verbal agitation, the extremely harsh rhetoric. You can feel the power of the Buddha getting pretty tweaked about these kids, right? And there's plenty of other examples of some of the other people in the Sangha where they are teaching and they also say stuff like that. And you could like, okay, these people can get a little bit tweaked here.
Wow.
And they also want things.
Okay, so the next one I wrote down
they want things to occur.
Was a 0 on attachment, like period, like not attached to a damn thing.
Yeah, so that's also clearly not true. If you read the old texts, you can see the Buddha talked about one fortunate attachment, and they clearly had other attachments. They had attachment to their ascetic ideals. They had attachment to their notions of social justice. The Buddha clearly cared about the problems with the Brahmanic caste system when he didn't have to. He could have wandered into the jungle, ignored the heck out of all these social problems, never taught anybody, not cared about anybody's suffering or whether or not they woke up. But clearly the Buddha cared about those things, as did plenty of other people in the Sangha, or we wouldn't have the tradition today. No one would have bothered.
There was even the attachment of keeping it going in its pristine form.
Absolutely. And so like there's all this stuff, right? And so you start reading this and you're like, okay, wait a second. No, that clearly doesn't hold up.
Okay, so then the next one, a complete zero on identification. No identifying with a damn thing at all anywhere.
Well, experientially, that is a doable thing. And yet the mammal itself still reacts in a way that externally looks very much like identification. It will defend itself. It will feed itself. It will get things for itself. It will say, oh, this is my dharma, my teaching. I am awake. The first thing the Buddha ever said to anybody that wasn't a snake or a god
was,
right, I am awake,
the enlightened
being,
the supreme being in the universe.
Right, exactly. I am this knower of worlds, trainer of gods and humans and people to be tamed. I am the supreme knower of this with
that
all
was
these
the
powers.
First thing you said.
I am this, I am that, I am amazing. I'm the fucking bomb.com, right? And so that was, he unloaded this astounding assessment of the capabilities of what he was. Well, you could just say that was an empty assessment occurring, or you could say that's the ability of the Buddha to identify a Buddha as being what a Buddha is. Arose by any other name is still what it is.
Then the next one was a complete zero, was fear. All fear gone.
You could also totally not true. We see this in Channa, which is one of the more touching and sort of tragic examples in the Buddhist literature. Channa is the Arhat who killed himself.
Yes.
He feared more pain. And he had some very painful illness at the end of his life. And someone came to see him and said, Channa, how you doing? He's like, yeah, this sucks. I'm going to use the knife, which is, I'm going to kill myself with a knife. And they were like, no. And, went back and forth to the Buddha, back to Channa. Blah. Anyway, so finally, Channa is like, I can't take this anymore. I can't stand the suffering. I need to kill myself, and killed himself. And they went back to the Buddha, and the Buddha was like, yeah, basically. Mm-hmm.
Because there is that knowing that only an arahant, this is how I understood it, could in all clarity could kill themselves. Like that was
and have it be non-karmic in some bad way. Right.
That was how
that's what the Buddha said. And I get that, sure.
So, but what you're
the Buddha also, when the Buddha started getting really sick from either food poisoning and or ischemic bowel syndrome, there's a fascinating article about how it might be ischemic bowel rather than food poisoning. But the Buddha, in response to this, was like, this sucks. I'm going to try to escape from it in jhana.
So this is at the end. This is what kills him.
At the end of his life.
Yeah.
So he's got really terrible pain. He's like, I got to get away from this. Oh. And the Buddha goes into jhana, and even in the deepest jhanas, when he came out, he was like, even in the deepest jhanas, I could find no refuge from this suffering. I could find no escape from it.
Are you saying that potentially even how some yogis can just stop their heart, like Yogananda did? Like Yogananda also killed himself. I don't know if you were aware of that. Yeah, so he killed himself by stopping his heart when he gave his last talk. Wow. So he had that much power over his body at 53 or whatever. Just turned himself off. Yeah. So people with those sort of capabilities can literally stop their own heart and keel over. Yeah. And so are you suggesting that the Buddha might have, because he would have had those capabilities too, I presume?
Yeah, probably was like time to go.
Because he just died pretty quickly when he was at 80. He probably presumably could have kept on going.
Well, that was one of the myths, right? He said, Ananda, had you asked me 3 times or whatever, I would have stuck around.
For 500 years or whatever he was going. So that's also quite curious.
I don't know. It's an interesting tale, but the more curious tale is regarding your point about fear, and pain. Clearly the Buddha was not into
But now we're actually entering into just a little side topic here, just about how the Buddha, because he's all-knowing and all-seeing as well, and when he gets to the table and there's the dish and there's the dozen people or whatever there is, he grabs the dish and eats all of it, instead of saying, hey, everybody, this is poison, let's have a nice meal.
Right.
No, he has foreseen, or whatever, it's kind of suggested, he's foreseen his own death. And therefore,
he knows.
There's a way of saying this, that the Buddha actually killed himself.
Sure.
There is a way of...
There is, definitely.
And so if that was you or me, and we were in our own mind, you'd say, yeah, he killed himself.
Absolutely.
And then on top of that, now you're saying, well, not only did the Buddha kill himself because he saved everybody else, now he actually was feeling the full expression of that, what he'd done to himself, poisoning himself. Now he was in agony, and he wanted to escape the agony into the jhanas.
Yeah, and couldn't do it.
And then there he is lying. He says to Ananda, okay, I'll give you one last night, dude. Get them,
Yeah.
line them all up, and I can hang out here for another 12 hours. And that's it.
Yeah. And I'm out of here. Fear is this pervasive thing that drives behavior. I've actually gotten to hang out with a child who feels no pain. They exist. They're very rare. They do not tend to live long because with no pain, their feet, their hands, their bones all get broken. Sores don't heal, cuts don't heal. They burn their hands on stoves. They do not appear to have emotional pain as far as I can tell either. They have this sort of transcendent, otherworldly something that seems utterly unfearful in a way that no other human, including those described in the old texts, is.
Wow.
And so pain and a little bit of fear of feeling pain is a great way to stick around. Because if you truly have none of that, I can tell you what happens to you because I've seen it.
Okay.
And it's just like you'd figure when you just keep going with that.
Got it. So
They
for
actually
myself,
need a team of people watching them to make sure they basically don't kill themselves.
what I experienced was the breakthrough in these experiences was the letting go of the fear of fear. So while I still feel fear, I'm no longer afraid of.
Proliferating it based on the fear of
Well,
fear.
I
Yeah,
actually have
yeah.
so much freedom because I can do anything and I can feel the fear. In fact, I can fully open up into it. For me, the experience has been one of no longer trying to settle everything and push it down. It's like just
Yeah.
feel it fully.
Sure.
But the egoic, the identity in there is afraid of the fear. But if I just lean into it and fully open to it, it just disintegrates. It's just it's gone. Like
Nice.
in the past, it used to sort of congeal and consolidate.
It's a serious upgrade, isn't it?
And oh, okay, there's no need to feel the fear, just feel it fully. So that's anyway, so that's okay. And then the last one in this list that I put together on the final point was conceit. And so a 0 level on the conceit. Now I just want to add my little interpretation is that it would actually be an internal check. Like it doesn't really matter that everybody else thinks I might be an egomaniac prick or whatever, because if I'm in the space, and I'm the only one there's only this experience in the mind going on. It doesn't matter what anybody else thinks. To the extent that I've let go, transcended, seen through the illusions of self, that's what counts, is this experience. And so somebody else might say, well, he looks pretty conceited. That doesn't matter. What matters is checking within.
Yeah, it's not what the word meant anyway. It's a very bad translation of the Pali.
Right. All I'm pointing to is that some of this would be an internal reference that was only really necessarily validated by this living experience.
Correct.
And so, however, now you're adding in that really it was just the quite kind of gross form of I am, like, really actually believing and advocating the I amness of typical human experience.
Yeah. And the other thing is you have this sort of notion that if there was an arahat, of course you'd know them. You'd know them by all these things. They'd have all these obvious signs. Mm-hmm. Well, the texts do not bear this out also either. So when the Buddha was dying, one of the last questions was, how are we going to tell who are the arhats? Because they didn't know. And they were like, you were always around to use your psychic powers and you could see who was truly an arahat and who actually wasn't, whereas we can't tell. That's pretty telling in and of itself. The Buddha's answer, I can't remember the exact wording of it, but it's not particularly satisfying in all honesty. And I think that's
basically
also
like,
telling.
Good luck, dude.
Yeah, good luck, basically. Yeah. Some textual scholar is going to correct me on that, but the basic message remains.
Right. So then I had these positives in our idealistic view of what this arahant, perfect being, illuminated, free from all defilements. Those are all the negative ones, negative in inverted commas. Mm-hmm. Then all the positive in inverted commas were that they would be maxed out on energy, like basically like a webuside or never sleeping on 24/7.
Yeah, that's just simply not true. The arhats in the old text slept. They got tired. They got sick. They needed to have people care for them sometimes. As they got older, particularly, they slowed down. We have some reports of some of the more famous ones' lives and how they went. They would get fatigued after a long journey, walking somewhere. It's just not true that they always had boundless energy till the moment they died. It's just not true.
Okay. Then the next one was like in this imagining incredible generosity, just like so profoundly generous. Like they transcended a view around what was my property and what was yours.
Well, it is true that all the monks back in the day had very few possessions, but that's true of even novice monks. So it doesn't show anything. But in terms of generosity of the things that they could give, which would be Dharma teachings, The ideal of Pratyeka Buddhists is there because of people who were Buddhists who didn't teach.
Hmm.
And that's a grade up from Arhat because you're really on a 6 grade system, but it's actually got more dimensions than that. So above us, just a regular Arhat is a Pratyeka Buddha.
Which happened to his cousin, after he.
Okay. And then you've got full Buddhas. You could be utterly ungenerous with your teachings, which is the one thing that monks really have to give.
Ah.
And so that's the second highest grade of awakening, is a Buddha that has no generosity in that regard at all.
Wow. Thanks for that. That's interesting. Okay. So then the next one I've got here in like Max.
And there were a bunch of arhats who just wandered off into the forest and never taught. They didn't take students. They weren't sharing the one thing that they really had to give was their wisdom. That was part of the ideal for some of them. They just wandered off.
In fact, let's go back to the Buddha. His original first thinking
was to wander off. Right?
Well, no, he
no
sat
generosity.
there. The top god in all the universe
had to beg him and convince him and show him and say, hey, look, no, dude, look over there. Oh, okay, I guess I'll go. But it's going to be a pain in the ass and it'll be all this trouble.
I'd much prefer, I just want to sit here under the forest.
Here, right? So like we can just trash that one straight out.
Okay. Then the next one is like this boundless, nonstop kindness, just so kind and loving. Like they just remember, this is how we could identify and witness and see somebody go, oh, they're an obvious arahant. There they are doing that.
Except the Buddha was sometimes really nasty in his rhetoric to people. And he'd say, you totally said the wrong thing. You have no idea what you're talking about. You're just causing suffering, deluding people. And then some people he wouldn't even teach. He's like, no, I'm just not going to teach you. There's a classic sutta where he talks about the analogy of the horse trainer. And the horse trainer, when you get a bunch of new horses that haven't been broken, and you evaluate the horses and you try to train them all, and some are relatively easy to train, and some are kind of more difficult to train, and then some you just can't train. And he said the horse trainer will then just kill the horses he's bought that can't be trained. And this is like a spiritual teacher or a Buddha. If I can train you, okay, but otherwise I'm going to kill you, which was an analogy for, I'm just not going to talk to you. I'm not going to share any wisdom with you because you're untrainable. It's a waste of my time. And he was
that was the story he gave.
And yeah, this is, you can look up the analogy of the horse trainer, and he was constantly being extremely harsh to the Brahmins, pretty harsh to the Jains, harsh to a lot of people with all these doctrines. And the Buddha would not pull punches. That's the thing. He has a sort of brutal honesty about him, sutta after sutta, and a lot of pretty violent analogies, of which the horse trainer is one of the more graphic.
Wow. Okay. So then the next on the list of how we'd be noticing this profoundly illuminated arahant would be their patience. They'd just be profoundly patient, able to bear with anybody through any length of whatever they're going through.
Yeah, except the Buddha had no tolerance for bullshit even among his monks, and got impatient with them and left them for 3 months to fend for themselves on the rains retreat one time. So that's just not true. And the Buddha would get impatient with people talking with him. It's like, you said the wrong thing. You said this thing. You shouldn't have said that. And would be very critical of their dialogue right to their faces. And then would just sometimes leave and say, that's it. We're done.
Okay. And then how about this like nonstop joy? They're just always in a joyous space. They kind of like lit up there happy.
Yeah, the Buddha clearly was not in a joyous, happy space at all times. Again, clearly suffered from migraines, back pain, would get irritable, get annoyed, get angry, and had quite a bite to his rhetoric.
Okay.
To freely speak his mind. And you could call that kindness, but the feel of it often when you're reading the text does not feel kind.
The last couple, complete stability of mind. It was profoundly obvious that this person was rock solid, unwavering. They were stable like a rock.
What does that mean?
That means that they're unfazed, serene. They don't flinch. You can tell that they have a consistency about them. They can keep on moving forward. They're just stable.
Yeah, the endless examples we've already talked about show that that's just not true.
Okay.
Even in the old texts, which are pretty fanciful. I mean, the amount of mythology that you find there and the amount of clear editing and insertion and probably deletion and hyperbole and exaggeration that we find there is so extreme that they left these things in is really telling. And I think one of the greatest teachings of the text is when you find these golden gems of true humanity and you're like, wow, this somehow made it through years of editing and transmission, and it's still in there. That the story of Chana is still in there. Nobody cut it out. They kept copying it and repeating it. They clearly found it to be of real value because ink and transmission time and mental time and memory and paper were expensive. And the fact that we still have these things meant they somehow found this truly valuable as part of the Dharma. And I think that's extremely revealing.
Two more. I think we've already covered one of them, perfect tranquility. This person is just so tranquil and peaceful, equanimous to the unbelievable degree. You can just see that they're in that space perpetually.
Yeah, and again, clearly that was not demonstrated by the Buddha or plenty of his followers who are arhats.
Okay, then one last one, which was profoundly wise beyond measure. Every decision they're making leading to a knockout result because of their unbelievable wisdom, where they just basically don't make a mistake.
I think that's also not true. So, not even everybody was even good at teaching everything. So, if you wanted to learn analysis of how to deconstruct things, he'd send you Sariputta. But if you wanted to learn powers, he'd send you to
Moggallana.
Moggallana. I mean, like they clearly had their limited skill sets, and there's individual things they were good at, and there are things they were not so good at. Some of them had good memories, some of them didn't. Some of them were really good at the Vinaya, the rules, the monastic code, and the discipline. And some, even the arhats, were not quite as good at it. And so you see these examples of the few people the Buddha will hold up as pillars of having this one specific or two specific skills. But he won't say, here's a person who, other than me, who does everything well. You get the sense they're more specialists than they are generalists who also happen to be ridiculously good at everything and knowledgeable.
So one of the things that I'm hearing in all of this now, we've gone through that sort of breakdown of all of our delusional fantasies of what humanity projects onto a perfect human being, like as we imagine for these texts, is that for oneself actually, and I also onto our projection onto others, there's a lot of freedom given here, because when one contemplates and actually does all this work and has this breakthroughs and awareness, one can then just reflect upon one's own abilities and one's own interactions with others, realizing that they are still a human and actually, but the whole identity has fallen away. And now they can even laugh in a way internally at the projections that they used to make themselves and that
Sure.
others could be making upon them.
Right.
And then so now it becomes very humorous that, yes,
humorous in one way and tragic in another, right? Because those
Yeah.
very delusions keep a lot of people from embracing their own actual human experience in that moment. So,
Right.
yeah, if you're willing to be a little bit cynical, very humorous. And from another point of view, a true Dharma tragedy, moment after moment after moment, because it perpetuates the ignorance.
So I'm sure that you've encountered people coming to you and disbelieving. I'm sure that you have had these experiences that you speak of, primarily because
yeah.
the behavior that you exude as a human, as all humans exude behavior, and then they're checking this list that they're carrying around in their mind and going,
Right.
no, he doesn't match this, all these points, because we've all got them all the time. But internally, you could well be potentially laughing, going, well, that's pretty funny that you're actually doing that anyway,
Yep.
because you are under your own delusional process of what you think is an arahant or a liberated person free from defilements.
Right. But any teaching that is in that moment making you deny your immediate experience as possibly being it is contributing to the problem. So all of these beautiful ideals are a double-edged sword. They can simultaneously be incredibly motivating of donations, of financial and logistical support, of
Keeping a tradition going.
followers, of keeping a tradition going. And thank God for all that, because that's the only reason we have the tradition now, for some of us to gain true wisdom from it. So even the defiled aspect of it can, in the long run, for some be incredibly beneficial. So I got to be very careful here, because thank God for all the delusional people that gave money for 2,500 years that supported the Sangha based on absurd ideals that then allowed me to have true teachings that I could actually practice and wake up from. So I got to be careful. But that said, any teaching that for the aspiring practitioner rather than for the aspiring lay donor, if you cross from being aspiring lay donor to one who actually wants to wake up, well, then you need to re-examine all that. And even though the ideals can be incredibly motivating to sit through the long hours it takes to organically rewire the brain and to deal with the pain and the expense and the opportunity cost, at some point, each of those becomes a hindrance. If in moment after moment, it makes you deny the actual feelings you have that you think are not spiritual feelings, or that you think should be gone or shouldn't be occurring, or this moment, because it isn't like luminous awesomeness, can't be the moment of awakening. So I can't really take it seriously and really investigate it and pay attention to it. Every single time that's happening, those ideals are totally fucking you, excuse my language. And so that's the double-edged sword of this beautiful mythology.
Well said.
Sadhu,
Sadhu, sadhu,
sadhu,
sadhu.
sadhu.
I think that's it.
That was delightful. Thank you so much for this delightful dialogue.
Yeah, really great. Lots of
Last
fun.
words or thoughts before we.
Well, you've basically convinced me. Like, here I am thinking, well, and actually, I still do have this, maybe because I still have that memory of that monk that I met in Burma all those years ago who was so perfect looking.
I've met a few people who seemed really perfect to me as well. But the other thing you have to remember is arhatship, while from a certain idealistic point of view means mastery of all three trainings, it's not true. It means mastery of insight. They have seen through the illusion that three characteristics are not true. They have seen pristine sensate clarity in a way that allowed the perception to flip over to the other mode of interpreting the exact same data at a baseline fundamental level. But there were arhats who didn't have jhanas. So the Buddha praised more those arhats who also had jhanas, but he recognized that some arhats didn't even have jhanas. And some arhats also didn't have powers, but the Buddha praised more those arhats who had powers. They just had a few, with the exception of Moggallana. He was the only one described as having all of them.
Okay, so why is this then? It's quite okay then to be an arahant with no jhana and no powers.
And no powers.
But then if you are an arahant with jhana, and maybe even one with jhana and powers, why is this even more praiseworthy? Is it because you now...
It's a greater level of mastery, right? You have mastered more of the things that the Eightfold Path offers in terms of reduction of suffering. So to really reduce suffering to the greatest degree you can possible while you're alive, you need to master all three trainings. And an arahat who can't go into jhana when they need some bliss is an arahat who doesn't have access to one of the things that can continue to reduce the suffering.
Well, just like the Buddha at the end, he's trying to jump into his jhana.
He's trying to jump into jhana in the face of that serious pain and discomfort.
So it's
in this case, it just happened to be pain so strong it didn't work.
Hang on, so just to really...
jhana is really healing to the mind.
Okay, so just to really clarify, what we're doing here is reducing or removing the most suffering possible in samsara.
You're working on all fronts. You're working on the ultimate front to eliminate the amount of suffering being caused by ignorance in the fundamental perceptual way, to eliminate that duality and just have reality experiencing itself. Even if you do that, jhanas are still way better. I feel better after I get up having been in deep jhana. It's just better. The mind feels nicer. The body feels nicer.
Do you want to feel better or not?
It's healing. Do you want to feel better or not? Just $19.95, 3 easy payments, whatever. And you can have these jhanas. But it is true. They help. They do something healing. I can feel it resetting good stuff.
Do you want to have healing or not? Do you want to fix your leg that's broken or not? It's basically...
And it was actually getting into deep jhanic states that helped me process a bunch of the traumas that came from working in the emergency department. I think jhanas actually helped me do some other healing things. And they also lead to powers, which I think have been psychologically helpful.
So how the
past life experiences have actually been psychologically very helpful for me. Like, they've actually changed the way I experience certain aspects of personality quirks in a relative way. So they've done something useful. I continue to train in concentration. I'm going on 9 weeks of concentration-based retreat this next year because those skills continue to deepen, and I think there's still value there. And I maintain a practice every day. I spend some time in deep jhanas because it makes this organism feel better. And if I go a few days without doing that, I'm like, wow, actually, I think I need to do that because it helps something physiologically in this mind-body system. It's just good.
Great.
I mean, I'm not the first to have said that, right?
No, that's all making perfect sense. But I was thinking it was more like...
But some arhats didn't have access to that. So the Buddha clearly praised those arhats who also then learned that.
But then the magical powers is the one that's getting... Because I'm thinking it's more about a display to get more followers. Because it's so attractive when
I'm
you can show...
not displaying powers to get followers. In this particular society, I think I've annoyed the crap out of a lot of people by even mentioning them. And they're like, oh, I thought he made sense. And then he mentioned he had powers. He's clearly a delusional nut job. So, I mean, it can be very harmful to even say anything about these, which is why they often didn't talk about them, because they would get the same reaction.
Actually, isn't it forbidden to even speak about such things?
Not really. The thing is, you can't lie about them. And they're really kind of not supposed to talk about them. Now, I should probably go back and review some of the Vinaya Code stuff and whether or not it's to lay people or whatever. And there's some funny things about that. But anyway, you definitely can't lie about them, right? You cannot lie about attainments if you're a monk. But there's no prohibition against lay people saying anything. But monks do have some specific
Okay,
rules
okay.
about who you can talk to about
I'm
what.
just remembering another thing I didn't put in the list then. I'd heard that it was impossible to lie as an arahant.
That's clearly not true. And you can tell the Buddha all the time was very selective about what he said, how he said stuff, spoke on a lot of different levels, which could easily be considered deception. To a lay audience, he would sometimes talk about rebirth when he was teaching about morality in a way that clearly implied continuity of an existent being.
Yes.
And it would never give a qualifier for that, just talked about rebirth and reincarnation. They were reincarnated as this, they previously were that. But the Buddha knew that, in fact, that's all not true. This is just empty causality unfolding. There never was a self in it. There never will be. It's like a candle. You light a candle and you light another candle with it. You blow the candle out. What is transmitted? Well, nothing except something, except nothing. It's just causality ringing on. And so the Buddha knew that. And yet sometimes he would talk at a level where he clearly knows he's lying. Right? He's saying something he knows viscerally isn't true. And in fact, literally the whole frigging point of his teaching is that that's not true. And there's a way to see through that. And yet sometimes he talked at that level without qualifying it at all. So clearly the Buddha lied sometimes. Or you could say selectively lied in the skillful way.
Okay,
like
then there's the other
maybe
one.
it had some benefit. It's kind of like white lies, right?
Okay, I'm
but
getting
it's
it.
still a lie.
Then there's the other one, which I'm also going to answer myself, that an arahant can't have sex. When the first rule comes into the Vinaya about that, one of his monks comes back to him, but I'm just not clear if he was an arahant or not, because he just had sex with his wife in the woods. And it was that returning and him saying, okay, Buddha, yeah, where have you been? I just had sex with my wife in the woods. And he was like, holy
no
shit.
Sex.
No, guys, I didn't think of telling you all this, but no sex.
Well, there was no rules for the first 20 years.
There was no rules.
And God knows what they did. We don't know.
It was 20 years, no rules.
20 years, no rules. It was 20 years of wandering around that had no Vinaya rules. Zero.
So they could have been having sex.
Yeah, we don't know.
Well, one of them definitely did.
Yeah.
Was he an arahant though?
Well, I don't know. But the other thing is, here's where the Zen people get helpful, right? And a number of the great Zen patriarchs, one of them lived in a brothel. There's this fascinating book, Lust for Enlightenment by John Stevens. I just love this book. And it really should have brought in a little bit of the Tibetan perspective. It didn't, which is kind of too bad. And so there's lots of different possible relationships to sexuality. But the notion that somehow you can't have a boner or ejaculate or make certain motions or put some organ in some other thing just because you perceive reality clearly, I'm sorry, that's just not true, right?
Okay. Yeah. All right.
They can move all these other muscles, but they just couldn't possibly move them that way. Like, yeah.
Got it. Clear. Well, there we go. So I think it'd be very interesting if there was a text that actually went through all of these points of how we imagine the Buddha. If we literally just transcribed what we discussed.
There's actually a book called Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha, where I actually go through all this. There's my whole section on the models of awakening, part 5. I go through all this.
Is there a section where you actually go through the Buddha himself? Like what we discussed here, where we actually itemized the areas?
Well, I use the Buddha as for the example. I've given some of the examples I just gave here in the book.
Wow, cool. Well, that's great.
Yeah, so you should check it out. Part 5, mctb.org for free, or you can buy it from standard booksellers everywhere.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. Bye.
Bye.